education at the University of Narayana. He works on cognitive linguistics, construction grammar, differential pragmatics, and functional approaches to language. He has published extensively on medicine, the economy, elocution, and has created, with Professor Ricardo Melo, the lexical construction model. He has edited or co-edited several books, including Cognitive Linguistics, Internal Dynamics, and Interdisciplinary Interaction. Cognitive Linguistics, Current Application of Future Perspectives. Defining Autonomy in Cognitive Linguistics. Theory and Practice in Functional Cognitive Studies. The Functional Perspective of Language and Discourse, Applications and Implications. The list is on and on, just to name a few. Now, it's time for Professor Luis de Mendoza Apenas.
Okay, thank you. Can you all hear me well? Yes, we are fine with this microphone. Okay, so this morning's talk is going to be about illocutionary meaning, and more specifically about how to motivate illocutionary constructions.
This is not.
Are we?
Not.
So it's not working.
I switched it off. I'm sorry.
Ah, okay. So, is it working now? Is it working, or is there something else I have to do? I should have tested this first. Sorry. So, can you all hear me now? Kind of, or you can hear me? Oh no, I hate this one.
It's too heavy.
It's like. Is there a way to put it so you can hear? No, that's more uncomfortable. So what if you put it here, like
Okay.
the closest
To the mouth.
that you can to the mouth? Is it working now? Yes, to some extent. Oh, all right. So I'll try to speak up. As I was saying, I'm going to talk about illocutionary meaning and illocutionary constructions. And I will try to motivate illocutionary constructions from the point of view of a scenario-based approach. In previous talks, I have been dealing with the notion of scenario. A scenario is simply a cognitive model. It can be defined as a situational cognitive model, and we can have low-level and high-level situational models, if you can remember that. If I have a sentence like, the blacksmith hammered the metal flat, that is a resultative construction. It makes use of argument structure configurations. It's a construction that is based on connections that we establish between different semantic primitive elements, like causing something to become something else. That's argument structure. At the situational level, what we have is something different. We have, rather than simply this type of abstract connections between argument participants in a construction, what we have is an enrichment of those connections that are based on reality, on how we experience the real world. In a situation, you have participant entities in their interaction, and their interaction follows a scripted sequence. So that's organized in time. Something happens first, then something happens second, then third. For example, if a teacher is going to teach you a class, he will first get into the classroom. Then he will address his students, use a PowerPoint projection, or he may use the chalkboard, and then start the lesson. The students may raise their hands and ask questions. The teacher will answer the questions. That's a scripted sequence. So this is what we are going to get. But we are going to get this in a different way than the one that I have described. The type of scenarios that we have in the world of illocution are of a slightly different kind. They are based on cultural and social convention. They are scripted sequences like the other ones, but they are based on cultural conventions about social norms. How do we have to behave? They are not descriptive, they are regulatory. Yesterday, I made a threefold distinction between descriptive, attitudinal, and then regulatory. Now we are with the regulatory kind. Okay? So let's go into it. Illocutionary meaning and the treatment of illocutionary meaning in cognitive linguistics. This is the first thing. What are the approaches that we have to illocution in cognitive linguistics? Well, I'm sad to say that not very many scholars have gone into illocution. It's something that we always take for granted. It's like, well, yeah, we know about illocution. It is pragmatic thinking. We have some rules and principles that guide illocutionary meaning. So let's focus on other aspects of linguistics. But at least the two scholars, Panther and Thornburg, that in the late 1990s decided to come to terms with the problem of illocutionary meaning from a completely cognitivist perspective. So rather than simply assume that there was pragmatics around and they would deal with that, they said, okay, what if there are cognitive principles behind the derivation of illocutionary meaning? So they made the following proposal in a paper that they wrote for the Journal of Pragmatics in 1998, that illocutionary meaning is based on illocutionary scenarios and metonymy, the metonymic exploitation of illocutionary scenarios. What is an illocutionary scenario? Remember that I talked before about low-level situational cognitive models and high-level situational cognitive models. They did not use that terminology, but basically when they define the notion of illocutionary scenario, that was an abstraction over a number of concrete experiences. So it was a high-level model. And because it was a scenario, it was situational. So I would say that the proposal that they made with the label illocutionary scenarios is simply can be described in terms of the labels that I have been using for these talks. An illocutionary scenario would be a high-level situational cognitive model. In their proposal, of course, they were not thinking about high-level, low-level things, nothing like that. They were simply thinking about experience in the world. And they went to John Searle's work on illocution, and they realized that the way that John Searle addressed illocution in terms of satisfaction conditions for speech acts to be possible could be somehow reworded in a cognitive linguistic way. They said that illocutionary scenarios are cognitive models, and they based those their description of illocutionary scenarios in three parts, three chunks, or three subdomains of what would be each speech act category. Here we have an example of the request scenario, but you can have the same for promises, offering, and any other speech act. For the case of the request scenario, the three components we would have would be the before, the core, and after, and they borrow from Searle's ideas to construct these pieces of scenario. The before component is simply John Searle's preconditions for the illocution to be possible. If you remember, John Searle said that it was necessary for the act of requesting to have an ability condition. You can't request people to do things that they can't do. So if I ask you to reach up to the ceiling, well, you will say, no, thank you, I don't think I have, I would need a ladder or something like that. So I can't do that. But if I ask you to give me a little bit of water, probably you can do that. So it makes sense for me to say, could I have some water? But it would not make sense for me to ask you to reach up to the ceiling. You would think that I'm joking, or that I'm crazy. So the before component specifies an ability condition, but in a different way. The idea is that the hearer, of course, has to be able to perform the act that is required, but that is not simply it is not simply a pragmatic condition. It is knowledge that I have in the mind. So it's part of a cognitive model. That's illustrated by questions like, can you do that for me? Can you do this? Can you do that? Or you can do that for me? Also, there is a desire condition. It would be foolish for me to ask you to do something that I don't want you to do. So it makes sense to have this second precondition. As for example, in I would like you to answer the phone, it means I want you to answer the phone. Would you like to answer the phone? And so on. So we need these speakers or also hearer's desire as preconditions for the act of requesting. And they can be modeled cognitively. We have concepts, we have notions about them, they are stored in the mind. Then they proposed another component of the request scenario, a second ingredient, which is the core. The speaker puts the hearer under the obligation to perform the act. This is very much the same as the essential condition in traditional speech act theory. When you request someone to do something for you, you are putting pressure on the person. And the person can say no, but that is challenging to the speaker. So there is a degree of pressure, there is a degree of obligation. As in, for example, give me your newspaper. That is very strong, right? You wouldn't like to say that. Could I have your newspaper? But that would be a more polite request, but with a smaller degree of intensity. Then they propose the after component, the third component, and that contains the expectation that the act will be carried out. As in, will you open the door, or you will open the door? Or open the door, will you? Even tag questions like will you and can you have to do with these conditions. If you think about it, when you say open the door, can you activates the before condition. If you say open the door, will you, it's the expectation that the action will be carried out. Or you could also think about it from a different perspective, because will is ambiguous between desire and future. So will you meaning, do you want to do it? And do you want to do it would be the desire precondition. So this was more or less Panter and Thornburg's idea, and I think it's a very good one. But, well, before we talk about the strengths and weaknesses, look at the diagrams. These are diagrams inspired in Panter and Thornburg's proposal. You have the metonymic support for the activation of the whole scenario. So the before component, like can you do that or you can do that, specifying the ability to perform an action or addressing that ability, stands metonymically for the whole request to perform an action. The same with will you, won't you. The willingness to perform the action can stand for the whole scenario. And the future action can also stand for the whole scenario in expressions like you are going to do that, you will do that. So in Panter and Thornburg's formulation, what we have is a scenario that is based on the Searlean conditions for speech acts to be possible, and then we have the metonymic exploitation of those scenarios. And it is the metonymy that provides the inferential schema, the underlying inferential schema, for us to derive the illocutionary meaning. And then the assessment. So the idea is a very good one. But of course, they didn't claim that they had exhausted all the theoretical possibilities. They didn't claim that they had solved the problem of illocutionary meaning from a cognitive linguistic perspective. It was a sketchy proposal. And because it was like that, even though it was such a very interesting and pioneering pioneering effort, still there were some problems. We were going to deal with some of them. As I said, it is a pioneering effort in dealing with illocutionary meaning, the first one that I know about in cognitive linguistics. And it introduces new motivating factors in the study of illocutionary meaning, like the problem of conceptual organization is fixed, and also the idea of metonymy-supported inferencing. And another strength of their account is that it brings together research into pragmatics with research into cognition. The two worlds are married. But there are many factors that they don't take into account. For example, the inherent politeness or impoliteness of speech acts. If I say, "Can you do that for me?" that's more polite than saying, "Do that for me." And I can be more polite if I use a more indirect expression like, "Do you think you could do that for me?" or "Would you mind doing that for me?" So politeness phenomena were not contemplated in their theory, and other social factors were not contemplated either. So there's something that is missing, and because those problems could be easily identified, a colleague of mine and myself tried to fix some of these problems in a study that was published just a few years after Panta and Thornburg's paper, also in the Journal of Pragmatics in 2002. Perez and Ruiz de Mendoza, 2002. And we enriched their original account by introducing into it remarks on the power relationships between interlocutors. Introducing the optionality scale that is very well known in pragmatic theories. We talked about politeness and the connection between the locutionary scenarios and degrees of politeness. And also the notion of cost and benefit that was borrowed from work by Jeffrey Leach in pragmatics, and that we thought cost-benefit, which is a pragmatic scale from the point of view of Jeffrey Leach, from our point of view, cost and benefit could be cultural convention of some sort, and therefore the object of cognitive modeling. So we introduced those components, and of course we respected the idea that we have these before, core, and after ingredients in the creation of speech act meaning. So we extended the scenario approach. We created the extended scenario approach. Now, this is simply a first stage. Then there was a second stage that I carried out by myself, and then with the help of other colleagues. So in this first stage, we have the notions of power, the notions of choice, the notion of directivity in connection with power, brought into the picture. So think about it. How can we interrelate all those variables that were missing from Panta and Thornburg's account? Think of power. A speaker's power determines his or her capacity to act in a way that is costly to the addressee and beneficial to the speaker. So there is a connection between cost and benefit and power. If I am a powerful person, probably I can say, "Do that for me." If I am not a powerful person, maybe I shouldn't say that and use a more indirect approach. Like, "Could you please help me? Could you please do that for me?" Or it would be a good idea if I could so and so. So the idea is that cost and benefit and power are somehow interrelated. Second one, the forcefulness of a directive act increases with the amount of power of the speaker over the addressee. So again, a person in power, think for example of a military context, can produce a command without any problem, and everyone will stand to orders. No problem about that. But in a context where you are, for example, with your friends, the power relationship does not really exist. There is solidarity rather than power. And because there is solidarity, an imperative is out of order. It is out of place. If you are with friends, you will not produce a command. You will not use the imperative. You will use other more informal approaches to get people, to get your friends to do things for you. You can use requests, of course, but very rarely commands. And at the same time, the greater forcefulness of the directivity of the act, the smaller the degree of choice for the addressee. So because we have a lot of power, directivity goes up, and if directivity goes up, degree of choice of the addressee goes down. There is a balance, right? So those were observations that we made in the first stage of development of the scenario approach. And these interrelations here have two interdependent pragmatic effects, which I think are important. And they hinge on the choice variable. One is the directivity effect and the other the politeness effect, which are central to speech act theory. Directivity arises from the degree of choice that the hearer is given to refuse. In the military context, for example, there is no choice to refuse. In the context of a person being with his colleagues or friends, with his peers, well, there is a greater choice to refuse. A lesser degree of choice produces greater directivity, while greater choice lowers directivity. Commanding has a greater directive force than requesting, and requesting than pleading. So we can have degrees of directivity, and those will be reflected by different categories of a speech act. Then the politeness effect, or the lack of politeness, that is, impoliteness, arises from the degree of directivity of an utterance. Greater directivity involves less politeness, and smaller directivity involves more politeness. That's why imperative forms are usually impolite in directive speech acts, while indirect forms of approach are more polite, because indirect forms lower the degree of directivity. It's lesser directivity, greater politeness. So this is the first development of Panta and Thornburg's initial proposal. But there was a second stage of development, which I undertook by myself, almost. In this second stage, it was determined that we were going to discard power and optionality, not completely, but we were going to make them secondary variables rather than primary. So in the first approach, everything was like at the same level of importance, and then there were interrelations. But then we realized that because of the interrelations, because of the connections that we could make between the different variables, anyway, we had already observed that some of the variables seemed to be a little bit more prominent. That's the case of the notion of cost and benefit. If you think about it, directivity, politeness, which correlate with power and optionality, ultimately depend on cost and benefit. So the greater the cost for the hearer of a speech act, and the greater the benefit for the speaker, the greater the directivity. So do that for me, and there is no way out. You have no choice. My benefit goes up, and the cost to the hearer also goes up. So they are equals, and it depends on the relationship between speaker and hearer. Yes? So if I ask a subordinate to do something for me, and the subordinate has no choice to say no, I will get what I want. So the benefit goes up, and the cost goes up at the same time. But it depends on the speaker-hearer relationship. So I don't need to talk about power and optionality because it is implied by the cost-benefit relationship. There is power, of course, and there is optionality, there is choice, but it can be deduced from the cost-benefit relationship in a communicative framework between speaker and hearer. So, from a theoretical perspective, I can dispense with those variables in the account and give them a secondary role. And I also observe that besides directive scenarios, commissive and expressive speech acts were also regulated by cost-benefit relations. And this is a very important thing. It will be more evident later on as we examine more examples. But just to give you an idea, think of promises. In the case of promises, if I promise someone to do something for him or for her, I promise my son to buy him a new bicycle. He loves bicycles. Okay, you shall have a bicycle. Oh, well, inherently, my promise is going to be costly for me, but beneficial for my son, if he gets the bicycle, if the promise is fulfilled, of course, if I'm not a liar. So I'll buy you a bicycle, or you shall have a bicycle. Again, hinges on the idea of cost and benefit. And I can use a cost and benefit, this cognitive model, to understand a commissive speech act like making a promise. And also, with respect to expressive speech acts, we have about the same. Expressive speech acts are attitudinal. But by expressing attitudes, I express how I feel, and people also have feelings about how I feel or about what I say. Imagine that I congratulate someone. I have a friend, he got a promotion, and I say, hey, I'm so glad, congratulations on your promotion in your work. Well, that is psychologically good for the addressee. And I also feel good about it because I'm congratulating. So the idea of cost and benefit is there. Cost goes very low. It is all benefit. But in motivational, in psychological, in attitudinal terms, not in descriptive terms. So if we go into that dimension, then expressive speech acts can also be explained to a large extent on the basis of the cost-benefit cognitive model, which is already pointing us in that direction. Rather than talk about all those variables that we had in the extended scenario-based approach, why not simply postulate a cost-benefit cognitive model and see how it works? The ins and outs of the cognitive model, a detailed description of how it works. And of course, we have to understand that this is culture-bound. The cost-benefit idea changes with cultures. So this is more a description for an Anglo-oriented understanding of directivity, expressiveness, commissiveness, and politeness, and so on. So it is culture-bound, but I would say that in general, even though the way of realizing or the way of materializing the cost-benefit model, probably all cultures work on the basis of that variable, because in all cultures we have power relationships, we put pressure on people. That's simply a universal of human interaction. So probably it is universal, and then there are specific adaptations to cultures. Because you come from a different culture from my own, you will be able to see some differences probably in the way you handle these variables from the way I handle them. But because you are conversant with the Anglo-Saxon world, you probably will understand the examples that I will give. All of them are in English. Now, the result of doing this, of reducing everything to the cost-benefit cognitive model, gives us an integrated theory of illocutionary meaning construction, because it uses cognitive modeling to understand pragmatic inferencing. And what I'm doing here is not very different from what I did yesterday with attitudinal scenarios. Not very different from what I did with descriptive scenarios. and not very, very different from what I did in my first talk when I discussed cognitive modeling. We have one single engine, one single set of mechanisms that allows us to deal with a broad range of different phenomena pertaining to the world of meaning construction. So my actual goal is a unified theory of meaning construction that can be, of course, cross-linguistically valid too, and so on and so forth. But for the time being, I will restrict it to the examples that I use that are mostly in English or Spanish or a few European languages. And occasionally I have examples from other languages, but mainly European languages. So I do not make any typological claim. I know that some of you may have that question in mind. I do not make any typological claim, but I can make some very specific local cross-linguistic claims on the basis of the work that we have been doing at the University of La Rioja. Okay, now let's see how we can create this cost-benefit cognitive model. I will tell you how it was created. We went through thousands of examples of sentences in context, and we manually annotated their illocutionary force. What we thought as analysts was the illocutionary force. Now, we do not have the same, to analyze illocutionary force, we do not have the same mechanisms that linguists have in other areas of research. So we need a lot of manual work. This is the same with metaphor, metonymy, with hyperbole. You can go and go through like hundreds and sometimes thousands of examples, but ultimately you have to decide as an analyst what is going on the basis of intuition. And some people have produced some alternative approaches, but they're okay. But from my point of view, we can go further with this approach than we could go with a more statistical approach. So the research that we do is mainly qualitative, it is not quantitative, but of course quantitative, complementary quantitative approaches that fixes some of the problems here are welcome. Yes? So keep that in mind for those of you that are concerned with methodology. This is not quantitative, even though we have used thousands of examples over 3 decades now of research. We went to examples like this, and we tried to group the examples in ways that common patterns could emerge. And of course, we worked on the basis of trial and error very many times. So okay, this sentence is an example of what? And try to adapt the sentence and categorize it. Sometimes it's a matter of debate. So after struggling with examples for quite some time and a lot of debate, well, we grouped them from the point of view of the things that they revealed in terms of scenarios. If you take these examples, I am cold, I have fear, I think I left my purse in your home, I wish I could find a way to solve this mathematics problem, they all have something in common. There is someone that needs something. Someone is in need. And you have hundreds of examples like this, with, of course, completely different syntactic configurations. We're not thinking of the syntax right now, we're thinking only of the meaning in context. So in context, these examples show that someone needs something. Look at the second set. Can you give me a sweater? Do you think I could have a sweater? The examples like this are connected to the ability condition. So after all, John Searle and Panta and Thornburg, with the famous before component, were right. Sometimes we request by making emphasis on someone's ability to perform an action. Or we had examples like this. You could give me a sweater, couldn't you? Which is a way of raising awareness about someone's ability to supply for your needs as a speaker. So you need a sweater as a speaker, and you say, you could give me a sweater, couldn't you? Are you aware that you can supply, that you can provide for my need? Or in will you give me your sweater, we have the willingness condition, and in very many examples like this. And you will give me a sweater, won't you? It's a case of the, well, I want to persuade the addressee to help, but I'm not certain whether the addressee will help, and that is activated by that sentence. So these are the elements that they have in common, and they arise from context over which we generalize a little bit, but they were very specific context in the text from which we took the examples. So in some context, which we call scenarios, we have, well, A needs something and makes his situation manifest to B, and B takes care of A's need. Or A needs something and makes B aware that he has the capacity to provide A with what he needs, and B, in that specific example, ignored A's need. A is asking for something from B, who is in a position of authority. By appealing to B's willingness to help, B is moved to help. But B could have not been moved to help. So that was the example that we handled. And then in another one, A, who is not in real need, is asking B for help while pretending, oh, bad person, that he is in a needful situation. And B is deceived and is moved to help. So this is a case of a pretense request. And it has an effect, right? So B helps, and there was no need for help. So, and we have many more scenarios. So these are simply 3 that I give for the sake of illustration. There are very many. Out of those very many, we find these common elements and then these realizations. So, what about ordering? The illocutionary scenario for ordering. Again, we have some real-life scenarios. Someone needs something and makes the situation manifest to somebody else in a compelling way, so B cannot refuse to perform the action. That is a possible scenario. Another possible scenario, A, who has power to compel B to do as he wishes, expresses his wishes to B in an authoritative way. And another one, A, who has authority over B, directly urges B to act in a specified way, and B performs the action. And you can have very many more. Elements that these and others have in common. At least these 3. A person appears to be in need of something. The person compels the addressee to perform the action which satisfies his need. And the addressee is under pressure to satisfy the speaker's need. Do we have linguistic realizations of this scenario? Yes. For the first one, don't be told what to do. For the second one, the person compels the addressee, make your bed at once. For the third one, you mind your own business and leave this to me. So this goes a little bit beyond the traditional approaches to speech acts. Because if you realize about it, when you say don't be told what to do, that looks like an order. But it is an order it is not a prototypical order in which you are going to oblige, you are going to compel someone to act in a certain way. It looks more like a piece of advice. If I were in your shoes, that's what I do. Please don't be told what to do. Act as I would act. So this is an order that shades off into a piece of advice. It is simply counseling. But I don't need to classify the act as one of ordering or advising. I simply go to the scenario and find the elements of the scenario that I can activate linguistically, and that's all. So this approach is a way of dispensing with the classical, traditional labels for speech acts. They are useful, they are convenient, but theoretically, they don't hold water. They are not necessary. You will see that more clearly when we see more examples. I need to control the time, and my watch broke 10:23. Okay, yes. Thank you. So let's go forward to advising. Again, we have a number of possible real-life scenarios. In one of them, I selected this only for convenience. A has A has a problem that he wants to solve but doesn't know how to. A asks B, a friend of his, who gives A a viable option. Another one, there is a situation that A believes is negative for B, a friend of his who is unaware of this. And A warns B and gives him what he thinks is a viable solution. So in general, these scenarios would call for the idea of advising. Which are the elements that these and others have in common? Well, a person appears to be in need of something. The person communicates to the hearer that that there is a state of affairs that may be beneficial for him, and the hearer is expected to perform the action which is beneficial to himself. Concrete examples that activate these ideas. Why don't you take an aspirin for your headache? For a person appears to be in need of something. You appear to need something for your headache. Why don't you take an aspirin? For the second one, the person communicates to the hearer that something is going to be beneficial. I'd buy that house if I were you. Why not? For the third one, where the hearer is expected to do something that is going to be good for himself, don't be deceived by his elegant clothes. So don't act in a way that will not benefit you. The case of offering. Again, we have some specific scenarios, like from A's perspective, B is in need of something. A tells B that he will provide him with what he needs. Another one, A tells B that he needs help. B tells A that he will help him. Another one, A learns from a third party that B needs something. A tells B that he will provide him with what he seems to need. Common elements. A person is in need of something, realized by sentences like, do you want another cup of coffee? Or have some more coffee. The speaker shows his commitment, second common element. The speaker shows his commitment to perform the action that satisfies the addressee's need. Example, I'll do that for you. And third common element, the speaker shows his willingness to help. I'd like to do that for you. We go to warning. Again, we have some scenarios. The speaker realizes that the hearer is going to act in a way that could be harmful to the hearer. The speaker tells the hearer about the potential harm of acting in such a way. The speaker realizes that the hearer is going to act in such a way that he could do unintended harm to a third party. The speaker makes the hearer aware of this situation. Then the hearer is involved in a situation that is doing harm to him, but he is surprisingly unaware of this. The speaker attempts to make the hearer aware. Common elements. A person appears to be in danger. Second common element, the speaker makes the addressee aware that there is a state of affairs that is not beneficial to that person. Third one, the addressee is expected not to become involved in a non-beneficial state of affairs. Examples, that wire that you want to touch is an electric wire. There is danger. The second one, be careful, watch out, stop drinking, it's going to kill you. If you touch that wire, you will get a shock. Third one, you should stop drinking. You're doing something that is not beneficial for you, that is going to cost you, that is going to do you harm. I don't think it is wise to shell out that much money when you are still in debt. The case of thanking. Again, we have a couple of examples of scenarios. A person acts intentionally in a way that turns out to benefit the speaker, and the speaker expresses his gratitude to that person. Another scenario, the speaker feels that he has not been benefited by the hearer's actions, but that it was his intention to act in his benefit. So the speaker acknowledges his positive feelings about the hearer's intentions. Elements that these and other scenarios have in common. A has done his best to act in a way that is beneficial to B, as exemplified by your work has been a great asset to our project. Then B acknowledges that he has positive feelings about A's efforts. I feel so good for all you've done for me. And B makes his positive feelings manifest to A by, all you've done for me has been great. Apologizing. Again, we have some scenarios. In one of them, A feels that he's done harm to B, he's sorry about it, and makes this clear to B. And B tries to play down the importance of the harmful event. Another one, A knows that he has hurt B's feelings, but A doesn't regret what he's done. Another bad person. But still prefers to make B believe that he regrets what he has done. So he's pretending. And B, who doesn't trust the sincerity of the offender's repentance, ignores the expressions of regret. That is a typical scenario. It happens. It's a very frequent one. Another possibility. A is not really sure if B has taken offense from his behavior and decides to express regret just in case. And B reveals to A that no offense was taken anyway. Are there elements that they share? Yes, there are. You have always a person that detects the possibility of having done harm to another person. Then the person shows his regret about what he's done. And the person's sorrow may or may not be sincere. And the other person may or may not accept the regret. Examples. For the first one, where you detect that you may have done harm to someone, well, maybe this was all wrong, was it? Second one, I'm awfully sorry to show your regret about what you've done. The third one, expressing insincere sorrow. This is in context. Honestly, I regret it. Out of context, it is impossible to know. And finally, the acceptance of the expression of regret. Okay, it was nothing. Don't worry about it. Yes, sure. Sure as shooting, which is ironical. When will you stop acting like a child? Come on. Yes? So they belong to the scenario of apologizing, and their ways of apologizing, even the ironical way, and sometimes you complain while you produce the apology. So we are combining traditional speech categories again, which means that categorizing in terms of apologizing, offering, and so on might not be a good idea after all, because there is a crisscross of categories. Yes? That will be sorted out. So don't worry. This is simply the stages. So it makes sense to work this way because you produce, you give analytical support to the theory, and at the same time you examine real data in context. You come up with generalizations, and then you try to match the generalizations with specific realizations. And on doing that, you become aware that the starting point, the production of scenarios according to the classical categorizations, like requesting, offering, commanding, and so on, is probably not the best idea from a theoretical perspective, because a single utterance can have several categories at work at the same time. What are the characteristics of illocutionary scenarios in this extended approach? So this refers to all the examples that we have examined. They are regulatory. Do you remember the label when we said we have descriptive, attitudinal, and regulatory scenarios? They are all regulatory. And they are high level because we work at the level of abstractions over reality. And they are situational because they involve interaction between participants. So if we want to define these scenarios, we would have to say illocutionary scenarios are regulatory high-level situational cognitive models. And that could be an adequate description. They're based on social conventions, they're here-oriented, they specify how the speaker feels that the speaker-hear interaction should develop. So we take the point of view of the speaker to understand the speaker-hearer connection. They are grounded in culture. They're socio-culturally grounded. And we know that socio-cultural grounding can be traced back to bodily experience. So we have a grounding of the grounding. Our culture is connected to bodily experience. So for example, we understand compulsion in terms of force dynamics. We put pressure on people. So it is image schematic thinking. So for those of you that want to go into that, there is a possibility of making a connection between this type of analysis and force dynamics, image schematic thinking, and bodily experience. Of course, this goes way beyond what Searle and scholars doing speech act theory would have ever proposed, but it is an interesting connection. If you read Johnson's book on image schemas, he already he makes a few passing remarks, if I remember rightly, about this idea. They are constructed by generalizing over a number of lower level situational cognitive models, those that were in the diagrams in the charts on the left. Yes, those were concrete situations. You draw from them generic level structure, and then you look for specific realizations of that generic level structure. So, the notion of offer, for example, derives from multiple experiences in our lives in which people identify other people's needs and show their willingness to alleviate them. That is common to all cases of offering. They are formally realized by means of lexicogrammatical configurations. When a given illocutionary scenario is associated in a stable way with a formal realization, what do we have? A construction. So, this approach underlies the notion of construction. But we need a high degree of conventionalization of the form-meaning pairing. And interestingly, there is a metonymic component. You will see that more clearly, in more detail, in a minute. The formal realization only exploits part of the conceptual structure of the scenario, so the linguistic expression only gives you part of the conceptual representation that affords access to the rest of the scenario. So we have metonymy. These are some of the advantages of the scenario-based approach over previous approaches, including the development by Panta and Thornburg. If you think about the conditions postulated by John Searle in the 1970s for speech acts, the satisfaction conditions, these were labeled preparatory, sinciety, propositional content, and essential conditions. The preparatory condition was that the hearer has to be able to do the action. The sincerity condition is that the speaker wants the hearer to do the action. The propositional content condition is that the speaker predicates a future act of the hearer. This is for the case of requests. And the essential condition is that the utterance counts as an attempt by the speaker to get the hearer to do the action. Now, there is a problem of circularity if you focus on the essential condition. The essential condition for requesting is that what you say is an attempt by the speaker to get the hearer to do something. So you're asking someone to do something, which is requesting. So you're going circular by including in the definition what you define. You request by requesting. And if what you have is a scenario-based approach, you simply make a connection between what people say and then the scenario. That's all. You don't need to specify these conditions. And then there's a degree of overlap. Think, for example, of the act of ordering. It is so close to requesting that it has the same preparatory, sincerity, propositional content, and essential conditions. There is no difference. If I want someone to do something, that person has to be able to do it. And I ask things that I want people to do. And it has to be a future act. Do something in the future. And of course, it counts as an attempt by the speaker to get the hearer to do something. So there is no difference between the conditions for requests and the conditions for ordering, or the conditions for begging, or many other directive speech acts. So we avoid the overlap by, again, linking linguistic expressions up with illocutionary scenarios. Then, another benefit of the scenario-based approach is that we can unify and clarify also at the same time the famous distinction between direct and indirect speech acts. There are several approaches to the distinction between direct and indirect, but what John Searle said is that you can have the grammar will activate a given speech act, but then you can transform that into something else, and that would be an indirect speech act. So for John Searle, can you pass the salt would be indirect, because it is a question, and you're building a request on the basis of a question. Well, some other scholars have argued that no, because this is conventional. Can you pass the salt? The can you X please form conveys directly the speech act meaning. But this is the Searlean approach. And closer to this idea that can you pass the salt is not an indirect speech act is the proposal that we have a form-meaning pairing that is stable, and can you requests are constructions. So can you form generally gives you access to a requestive meaning, and there is no problem. That is clearer when you add please, for example, or tags. Can you do that, please? There is no way out. That has to be a request. With can you, it could be an information question. And sometimes there is ambiguity, but in the same way as with lexical items. If I say bank, you don't know if I'm talking about the financial institution or the bank of a river. Bank by itself. But in context, there is no problem. I use bank in a sentence and you know what I'm talking about. Well, the same with can you. I can say, can you open the door? You know that is a request. But can you speak English? That's not a request. But in context, it could become a request if I want you to show off your ability to speak in English. Can you speak English? Just for a while. I want to listen to you speak in English. So sometimes we have this ambiguity. But there is no problem for it. In the same way as we accept that there can be a degree of ambiguity with lexical items. So I think the scenario-based approach has no problem in making a distinction between direct and indirect because everything is the same. There is no such distinction. It is like you use linguistic form to afford access to a scenario, and then you know the speech act category that you have. If you want to talk about speech act categories, which is not necessary, as I pointed out before. And the scenario-based approach also solves the problem of making a clear distinction between these constructions and then non-constructional approaches, which are based on using our imagination, right? So we are more original when we say something like, I think I left my purse in your home. If what you want is someone to solve the puzzle for you and tell you, yes, it's here, I have it, let me give it to you. It's like, please give me my purse back, because I think I left it there. And this is indirect. But from the point of view of scenario-based approach, well, you're talking about a problem you have and people will help you. So you don't need to say that there is a difference between saying, can you give me my purse? I think I left it there. Or simply, I left it there. I have the problem. There is essentially no difference. Other than the fact that when you use can you or could you, you're using a construction that is specifically designed for that purpose by speakers. And when you say something like, I left my purse in your home, you don't use a construction that is directly associated to a requestive meaning. Or the other example, I wish I could find a way to solve this mathematics problem, where you point to a need in the hope of getting some help. So the idea of having scenarios solves the differences, solves the problem of trying to draw the borderline between direct and indirect speech acts. It is simply a matter of, do we have constructional meaning directly designed for this, or do we not? If we don't, well, that's what some people call an indirect speech act. That's all. And if we do, we have a conventional mechanism. Then, the cost-benefit cognitive model. I hope you will be able to digest this. How much time do I have?
25 minutes.
Okay, yes, enough. I have a technical description of each item of the cost-benefit cognitive model, and also for the sake of easiness, I have an informal description. And you will love the informal description, right? Because it's clearer. This is simply social convention, social and cultural convention. So, do we have a rule in the English world that says, change the world for good if you can? Well, at least we have linguistic evidence that we have that rule. Can we express that formally? Yes, of course we can, by using the right terminology. With an if-then schema, yes, it is a condition-consequence schema. We can formulate all the items that make up the cost-benefit cognitive model. And we can see how they're exploited linguistically on the basis of this longer formulation. If it is manifest to A that a particular state of affairs is not beneficial to B, and if A has the capacity to change that state of affairs, then A should do so. And this covers any possibility of change the world for good if you can. Examples like, why didn't you help her when you knew she was in real trouble, is based on this idea that A should do so. You didn't do it, come on. You should have helped her. She was having a hard time. You detected a problem, you had the capacity to solve the problem, and you didn't do it. You should have done it. But couldn't you just give a hand? Wow, recriminating someone. He could have helped, he had the ability to do it, he didn't do it, he should have. You could have helped her, couldn't you? The same. He should have done it because he knew he could, and so on. Don't you feel that you could have looked after your parents before? Think about the consequences. Like, you should be aware that you should have looked after your parents better. You didn't do it. Don't you feel that you should do it? Again, this sentence hinges on the specification that you have to do things that are good for others if you are able to do them. Another item, I call it informally the don't do harm element. Technically, the definition is, if it is manifest to A that a potential state of affairs is not beneficial to B, then A is not expected to bring it about. In other words, you're not going to do harm to people, or you're not going to do things that are costly to people. Why did you hit your little sister? So you just had to pull a dirty trick, right? Do you know what you just did to me? You have broken her heart. Did you know that? Please don't do any harm to her again, I beg you. You may think I'm bulletproof, but I'm not. These are clear examples of the idea of don't do harm. Sometimes we do harm, so we are challenged by the speaker, and at other times they simply make us aware that we did harm. And they exploit the same idea. We go ahead with do good. If it is manifest to A that a potential state of affairs is beneficial to B, then A is expected to bring it about. Sorry, I didn't know you needed the blanket. If I had known, I would have done you good. I shall buy you a diamond ring. Promises. So we have apology here, and we have a promise here, and it hinges on the same part of the cognitive model. Have some more cake and offer. It's tasty. It's going to be good for you. Look what I have done for you. The same. I hope this reminds the addressee that you have done good for for the addressee. This is not a promise, this is not an offer. It is simply making the addressee aware that you have been acting according to the social rules. I hope you'll enjoy this song I've composed for you. I've been doing good. I boast about it, right? I've been doing good for you. And you sure will like this one. Listen to it. All of these exploit the same idea. Tell others what you need. If it is manifest to A that it is not manifest to B, that a potential state of affairs is or is regarded as beneficial for A is expected to make this manifest to B. In other words, tell people that you have needs, right? And sentences like, I do need your help to make this business go. It could be good for me. I really need someone to buy these stocks for me. People think that's what I need, and that would make me rich. Those are very clear examples. Another item, tell others what is good for them. If it is manifest to A that it is not manifest to B, that a potential state of affairs is beneficial for B, A is expected to make this manifest to B. This remedy will cure your acne, exemplifies this. I'd buy those stocks if I were you. Don't mess around with those guys or you'll be in trouble. You will definitely benefit through that program. So this is connected to the traditional idea of giving advice, right? In different ways. Tell others you feel good for them. The technical description is, if it is manifest to A that a state of affairs is beneficial to B, and B has brought it about, A should feel pleased about it and make this feeling manifest to B. Congratulating people. I'm so glad you passed your exams. It's good to hear you got it working. Congratulations, good job. And many other examples. Tell others you are thankful for what they've done. If it is manifest to be that A has changed the state of affairs to B's benefit, B should feel grateful about A's action and make this feeling manifest to B. These are all expressive acts, but they fall under the idea of cost and benefit. Thank you for what you've done for me. I really appreciate all your efforts. I feel you're a blessing in my life. So you were beneficial to me, and I feel thankful for that. It is my emotional reaction to one element of the cost-benefit cognitive model. Tell others you regret what you've done wrong. As in, I'm sorry, I regret all that I did. I feel really bad. I promise I will not do it again. The technical description is, if it is manifest to A that A has not acted as directed by parts A, B, and C of the cost-benefit cognitive model, in other ways, the parts that tell us that we have to do good to other people or to solve problems that other people have, A should feel regretful about this situation and make it manifest to B. We're coming to the end. Tell others you forgive them for doing wrong to you. As in, oh, no problem, forget about it, it won't happen again, things like that. If it is manifest to B that A has not acted as directed again by those parts about doing good to people of the cost-benefit model, and A has made his regret manifest to B, B should feel forgiveness for A's inaction and make this manifest to A. I forgive you, is the idea. Then tell others how bad you feel for their challenges. This is sympathizing, right? I know how you feel, but I can't help you this time. Sadly, that's way beyond my power. I wish I could help you, but I can't. It's a terrible situation, I'm so sorry. If it is manifest to A and B that a particular state of affairs is not beneficial to B, but A has no power to change it to B's benefit, still A should feel sympathy with B over the non-beneficial state of affairs and make it manifest to B. Tell others how good you feel for the good things you have done. Wow, expressing pride. If it is manifest to A that A is responsible for a certain state of affairs to B to A's benefit, A may feel proud about the situation and make it manifest to B. I have passed all my exams, all of them. I've convinced my boss at this time, and this time I'll have a salary raise. I feel so good I could finish the marathon. Expressing our pride. So, which are the characteristics of this cost-benefit cognitive model? And these characteristics are an improvement, are evidence of an improvement over the previous formulations. One is that it generalizes over specific characteristics of illocutionary scenarios. So we can dispense with the idea of classical categories for scenarios, like requesting, offering, and so on. But at the same time, if we want to, for convenience, we want to use one of those categories, we are capable of identifying the elements of the illocutionary scenario in any way. Remember that we had this preliminary stage where we analyzed different contexts, then things in common and linguistic realizations, that is more or less connected to the traditional categories. It is only when we take one step further into further abstraction and postulate the cost-benefit cognitive model that we discard the traditional categories altogether. So we can take one step back into the origin of the cost-benefit cognitive model, how it was constructed, and we will still have the traditional categories. So they are not theoretically a great idea, but they can be preserved in the account because they are at that stage of the postulation of the cognitive model. And it finds common structure, logical implications, and interactional connections among those scenarios. That's what we did before when we analyzed concrete scenarios, elements in common, and realizations. It cuts across traditional speech act categories. This is an essential point. Note that some directive and commissive acts respond to Part A, for example, of the ICM. The part that said, change the world for good if you can. For example, help your sister would be Part A, but it's an order. Do you think you could help your sister? It's a request. Have some more cake, it's an offer. I shall help you tomorrow, it's a promise. You should have helped your sister. It is an opinion, and it can be converted into reproving, a reprimand. Why didn't you help your sister? It is a question, but it is also a way of reproving. So we can dispense with the traditional categories and simply make connections between the relevant part of the cost-benefit cognitive model and specific linguistic expressions. What about metonymy? Remember that we had metonymy in the first approach by Panther and Thornburg. And I think that we can bring metonymy into the picture too here. I first need to mention something about the Searlean approach and the distinction between direct and indirect speech acts. I already mentioned this to some extent. I already discussed this. It is not a real analytical situation. This is what Searle said. An indirect act is one that arises from changing the locutionary value of a direct act. As in, can you do that for me? He would say that this is an indirect act. But this claim misses the fact that can you do that for me is highly conventional. It is a cognitively entrenched constructional form to express requests. And what is a more realistic approach? One that differentiates degrees of conventionalization or entrenchment of linguistic expressions to convey certain speech act values. And I would say that can you X for me from the data that we have handled is almost always, necessarily always, a request. The degree of entrenchment is close to 100%. When a formal expression, however, does not afford direct access to an illocutionary value, what does the hearer do? The hearer uses reasoning schemas, which are parallel to those that we use in implicature. Let's see how that happens. So I take simply one part of the cost-benefit cognitive model, and it is the part where you say that you should do good things for people, If it is manifest to A that a particular state of affairs is not beneficial to B, and if A has the capacity to change that state of affairs, then A should do so, as in, you should have helped your sister. And we work out the reasoning schema. And this looks very much like the one that we had yesterday for implicature and also for other implicated forms of meanings of an attitudinal kind. Do we have a premise? Yes. The premise is drawn from the cost-benefit cognitive model. If B is in need and A has the capacity to satisfy B's need, then A should do so. This is a simplified version of one of the items of the cost-benefit cognitive model. What is the explicit assumption? Imagine that you need water and you say, I'm thirsty, I am in need of water. The idea that B is in need of water. The conclusion that A should cater for B's need by giving him some water. Because if you have the capacity to do it, you should do so. If A is in need, then do it, which is the conclusion, do it. So we have a reasoning schema behind it, and we also have metonymic support for that inferential schema. In the metonymy, the speaker is in need activates the relevant item of the cost-benefit cognitive model, which is the ability stipulation in this case, and then that gives further access to the idea that you have to satisfy the speaker's need. The linguistic expression only gives you part, then the rest is derived metonymically. And it follows the same expansion-reduction pattern that we are familiar with now. Conclusions. It is possible to study locutionary meaning in terms of cognitive modeling as the result of the metonymic activation of illocutionary scenarios on the basis of the point of access provided by the content of the linguistic expressions. So what we have in mind is not the syntax, except in cases of very well-entrenched constructions, but what we have in mind is more the content. And we make connections between the content of the expression and the context, and with that information put together, we activate the relevant part of the illocutionary scenario. And that's a metonymic operation. Illocutionary scenarios are high-level situational cognitive models. They are constructed by drawing common conceptual structure from lower-level everyday situations. Illocutionary scenarios contain expectations about social behavior that can be abstracted away and grouped into even higher-level configurations, such as the stipulations of the cost-benefit cognitive model. So the cost-benefit cognitive model is at the highest possible level that we have been able to produce. The stipulations of this model can be exploited linguistically to produce expressions with a given illocutionary value, which is the case of constructions, illocutionary constructions, or other expressions that are on the way to become illocutionary constructions. Such expressions typically provide partial access. This is crucial. Only partial access to the stipulations of the cost-benefit cognitive model, which means that we need metonymic expansion to have access to the whole cognitive model, and then focus on the part of the cognitive model that is going to yield the relevant meaning interpretation, which is a reduction process. And this is all. We have some references here. Some of the work that was carried out for this research was done in conjunction with Annalisa Baiki, previously from Pavia University, now she's in Geneva, and Alicia Galera, who is the University of Almeria, and she's a former doctoral student of mine. And she's the co-author of the cognitive modeling book that I recommended you to read. So, thank you. This is all.
Thank you so much for your speech. And now is